Great to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Professor Smith.
Okay. All right, let me now move to part 2 and price discovery as we find it in The Wealth of Nations. And let me begin with the first experiment I did, which was in January 1956. And these results, by the way, shocked me. And I thought there was something wrong with the experiment, that the market converged so quickly and easily to the supply and demand equilibrium. That defied everything people believed, thought, and taught in theory circa 1950s. We believe supply and demand was a very abstract ideal. You would have to have very large numbers of buyers and sellers. They would have to have complete information. We had all of these stories, and in this first experiment, that totally shot that down. So what did I do in this first experiment? Well, it was a principles class. I had 22 sophomores in that class. And I gave the buyers each a secret value, and I have arrayed these values from highest to lowest. And so, in other words, I gave them a distribution of maximum willingness to pay values, because they would earn the difference. If they purchased a unit from some seller in the market, they would earn the difference between the value I had signed them privately and secretly, and the price they paid from some seller. So buyers here are all motivated to buy low. They know only their own value. Similar sellers are given a value which represents their cost. And if they can sell for above that cost, they can pocket that profit difference. So we motivate sellers by paying them the difference between the price at which they sell and their value as a cost. Now notice here on the left-hand side, I've got price on the vertical axis. There are no prices in the left-hand diagram. Marshall, everybody puts price on the vertical axis of supply and demand scales. There aren't any prices over there. That's a distribution of values and a distribution of costs. There are no prices in the left-hand diagram. The prices need to be discovered in the market, and we see them being discovered in a series of trading periods, period 1, 2, and so forth. And they're trading by an open outcry, two-sided auction. Okay, buyers announce bids, sellers announce asks. A buyer can trade by having his bid accepted by some seller, or by accepting the ask of some sellers. So it's a two-sided trading. And they immediately, that bid-ask process converged fairly close here to the equilibrium, and then we started to get trades, people accepting bids and asks. And then we repeat that as in the experiment. I mean, the typical experiment, we have a flow of goods coming into the market from sellers and a flow off the market by the buyers. Here is a second experiment I did right away, and notice it was not an artifact. The first results are not an artifact of symmetry. We still get convergence within 3, 4, 5 periods, even in the extreme case like shown here. So now I think it's important to realize that the classical economists represent market agents as we do today in modern auction theory. The commodity space is discrete. Transaction involves single units or batches of goods. So look at your shopping basket. Next time you go to the supermarket, you've got one thing of each item. You don't buy multiple units of items because they come packaged. Multiple units are packaged. You get a small, medium, large, or super large box of cornflakes or Wheaties. And that's universally true in these consumer markets. Notice that what markets do is they convenience package items to solve consumer inventory problem. Okay, depending upon your family size, how often you shop, how big your pantry is at home, you are buying goods in these discrete quantities, large, small, medium. Okay. So buyers, sellers really, the main focus they need to make is on what they're willing to pay or what they're willing to accept. Now, so value here is maximum willingness to pay on the part of the buyers. We can express that in an inverted demand function by saying Q is a function of price, where price is not greater than anyone's value who's buying in the market, and similarly on the sell side. So Smith models buyers and sellers by simple buy cheap, sell dear, higgling and bargaining strategies, where they're putting bounds on their amount they are willing to pay or willing to accept. And Smith knew about auctions. He doesn't analyze auctions in any one place in any of his work, but he makes side comments. For example, he has a side comment at one point. I don't need to give you the context, but he says, if two buyers equally desire an item, the one with the larger wealth would carry it. So he understands that the high bid wins and that things like taste and wealth matters. And you can see that that's guiding his thoughts in two-sided markets with supply and demand. He uses the concept of utility. He thinks about utility as providing value in use, but there's also value in exchange, in prices. He distinguishes these two sorts of value. Price in his thinking depended upon competitive entry, but by both buyers and sellers. But he particularly emphasized producers because he saw producers often in a hump, and the government often in a mercantilist unholy alliance in which the government was paying favors in markets. And so his whole critique of mercantilism is built around that. But anyway, here's what he says. He says here in the middle of the slide, if quantity brought to market falls short of effectual demand, those willing to pay the supply price cannot be supplied. Notice here, purchases are limited by supply on this side of the market. Some will bid for what they can get and price will increase. And then the obverse, if quantity brought exceeds demand, can all be sold to sellers willing to pay the supply price and price falls. Sales now on this side are limited by demand. So the two-part price theory in Wealth of Nations is fundamentally mathematical. He says the price change has the same sign as excess demand, and any price, at any price, the contracted quantity is limited by the amount demanded or supplied. We call that short side rationing in our model. So here's an elementary mathematical statement of what's in this chapter. Motivation is buyers want to buy cheap, sellers sell dear, but they have these maximum willingness to pay and minimum willingness to accept. And if we assume, as in the experiments, that trading takes place across a series of periods. So period one, buyers and sellers all show up with a desire to buy or sell. Period two, that desire to buy or sell is refreshed and goods are flowing into the market and off the market, okay, in each period. The price adjustment rule is the price change and excess demand, call that E of P, they have the same sign. So E of P to P to T here is positive. And then we have transactions taking place within periods and then across periods. Now, let's introduce V of P as the integral of excess supply. This is actually in my first paper, 1962, but I didn't begin to understand the full implications of it. My co-author, Sabu Inawa, has educated me on that, okay? So V of P here is the integral of excess supply. Notice that the VDT is non-positive, so it's non-increasing. And if you write this for discrete values, it's just sum over, what we're doing is summing over the profitable trades by buyers and the profitable trades by sellers. It's just a generalized medium in which we are truncating, you see, the values and costs that count so that we're only looking at the profitable. So V is a weighted distance in profit space between price and the trader's valuations that are profitable. Now we call P star the center market value. And P star minimizes this V of P function. It maximizes the surplus actually collected by buyers and sellers, and it maximizes trade, which is always the minimum of the amount of supply or demand. We call this the principle of maximum information. Market price evolves so as to reflect value better and better. It keeps moving until it's stationary. And that needn't be true that supply equals demand where it's stationary. In fact, all you have to have is take a constant cost industry, one where the supply curve is flat up to whatever the capacity of the industry it is. And where demand cuts that horizontal supply line determines the quantity traded, but there can be excess supply at that price. So implicitly, we have here, sort of the modern foundations of Hayek, Hurwitz, Radner, Ryder, and which talked about informational efficiency. The idea that the pricing system is a information system, and people make decisions based upon these prices. They make specialization decisions. The whole idea in Adam Smith that wealth is the division of labor leads to wealth maximization. And we're also going to use Shannon, the MIT electrical engineer in 1948, to calculate the explicit information content in prices. But here is just a summary of what I've been talking about. On the right here is a negative distribution function of demand. Here's supply as an asymptotically rising at a decreasing rate towards some limit, upper limit. So there's two distributions of supply and demand. Notice here that if price is below P star, the center of market value, we have demand being limited by supply, and if it's above, we have supply being limited by demand. Over here on the right, here's the V of P function, that distance between the price and the trader's valuations, being at its lowest point at P star, and then here's surplus actually collected by the buyers and sellers. And then over time, wherever this system starts, it tends to move toward a stationary level. And that's all, that's parameter free, that model. Now here's the information theory. think of a transaction in this market involving a buyer or seller, and they decide to trade at some price P. What does that mean? It means that seller's cost is no greater than the price P if it's profitable. Otherwise he's not motivated to trade. And the buyer's value is not smaller than P. So we have V and C are all private information, just like in my experiment, that first experiment I showed you. There's a trade, and now that's revealed. Okay, an approximation, you see. And the V measures the value added to society by that trade, and the C measures the cost of resources used up in order to satisfy that value. Now, so the trade informatively signals a net economic gain for society. Now, Shannon proposed measuring the information and an event realization by log probability of the event. So think of a large now smooth market. We can write the change of information, DIDP, as the log ratio of demand to supply. So hence the change in transaction information with a change in price is non-negative. So we have the V of P function declines with price, the I of P function increases. So now let me give you a parameter version, an actual institution of trade as an example of this. And of course, institutions of trade add more parameters, because those parameters basically describe how it is buyer and sellers actually get into contact with each other and trade. And so here's an example of multiple unit English auction with Q equal to 4. So here's the demand, say, a step function coming down. And suppose we have four sellers all willing to sell at any price above 10. So that would be the supply to this auction market. And in a multiple unit English auction, say 4 units, suppose someone bids 12 cents. Some buyer bids 12 cents. Well, under the Vickery rule, we got to get 3 matches. 3 people have to match that 12-cent bid. And when they've got 3 matches, then anyone can raise the bid. So we get 4 people willing to trade at 12 or bidding 12. Anyone now can raise the bid. So the bid goes up. And so the bids will rise until they enter this set here. You see, between 40 and 50. And here's the progression over time. Here's the V of P function, piecewise linear, because of these steps, reaching a minimum here between 40 and 50. And here's the Shannon measure of information, piecewise linear, rising to a maximum at between 40 and 50. Okay, Smith model of social action outperforms standard neoclassical economic utilitarian models by a factor of 2 to 1. That's in the trust game. And I'm thinking here now of the second mover. Yet people are modeled as self-interested. The key here is that Smith distinguishes between being self-interested and acting in a self-interested way. Okay, Smith uses this term over and over, that we follow rules that enable us to get along with our neighbor. So in the neoclassical equilibrium, this doesn't do this. It says that A is chosen over B if and only if the utility of A is greater than the utility of B. TMS provides an alternative model falsifying the only if part of it. So it doesn't have to be driven by utility, the traditional utility maximization, okay, but by these rules that we learned to follow. All right, let me okay, and the important thing is that in Wealth of Nations, Smith's model, his dynamic model, anticipates, you see, my experiment 180 years later. These books model the decentralized roots, origins of action in people, neighbors, buyers, and sellers, then inquires it to their consequences. Smith's methodology is to separate the origins of action from the consequences. And you can see here the mileage he gets out of that thinking process. All right, thank you. And here's, you can download either the Theory of Moral Sentiments or the Wealth of Nations free of charge if you go to these sites. And I would encourage you to read Smith in the original. Don't read me, read him. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Thank you. Okay. I thank the organizers for giving me the honor of participating in this very interesting discussion with Professor Vernon Smith. The title of my discussion is Vernon Smith Needs Sraffa, and we'll see if Professor Smith agrees with this thesis or not. A crucial topic characterized Vernon Smith's long research path and also emerged from today's lecture, especially from the second part of it. That's Professor Smith's profound dissatisfaction with the working of competition as it is represented in the neoclassical theory, with its unrealistic assumptions of price-taking agents, the auctioneer, and no trade at disequilibrium prices. According to Vernon Smith, this neoclassical unrealistic notion of perfect competition is a negation of any real competition. For these and other reasons, Professor Smith defines the neoclassical approach as an ecclesiastical theory, which has been accepted for a long time on the basis of authority and tradition about assumptions, without any empirical verification of those same assumptions. With respect to this ecclesiastical tradition, Vernon Smith's heretical laboratory experiments consisted in trying to simulate market supply and demand mechanisms, showing that the neoclassical assumptions of price-taking, auctioneer, and no trade in disequilibrium are not necessary in order to reach the equilibrium. This is Vernon Smith's fundamental past destruence of neoclassical theory, and we now come to his past constructs. The fact that in his experiments, an equilibrium can be reached without resorting to the unrealistic hypothesis of neoclassical theory recently led Vernon Smith and one of his co-authors to suggest that this result has some affinities with the old approach of classical economists, in particular with the much more realistic process of price discovery evoked by Adam Smith and others. Now, the fact that such an authoritative member of the global academic community finds a precise alternative to neoclassical theory in a relaunch of the classics, well, it represents a relevant epistemological and theoretical breakthrough. And in some respects, this breakthrough represents a novelty among the Nobel laureates in economics. Now, I am among those who have always insisted on the need for a comparative approach between alternative paradigms of economic theory. I have insisted on this approach in my debates with Olivier Blanchard, Daron Acemoglu, and others. Then I can only welcome Vernon Smith's new line of research. However, Precisely because of the relevance of Vernon Smith's breakthrough, we need to highlight that there might be a problem in his suggested link between his experiments and the classical approach. The problem concerns Vernon Smith's view on the so-called reservation prices. In his experiments, Professor Smith considers reservation prices as exogenous variables and defines them as the primitive concept in the theory of value. Now, this setting seems to have some drawbacks, both on the demand side and on the supply side. I shall focus here on just one of them. Let's consider one of the basic versions of Vernon Smith's experiments, which is based on a rising supply curve. We'll see something about that in Professor Smith's lecture. The foundation of this curve lies in the reservation prices of individual firms. Different reservation prices for different firms that produce the same good can be justified by the hypothesis that they have different techniques and therefore different costs of production. It's clear, however, that this can only be a temporary situation. Through the failure of the less efficient firms and the expansion or entry of firms using more efficient techniques, competition tends to reduce the differences between techniques and the related costs of production. Therefore, as Professor Smith himself notes, the result of competition is that firms' reservation price is ultimately determined by the same cost of production. The problem is that this cost of production, in turn, depends on the prices of the means of production. That is, it depends on variables that should be endogenously determined by the same process of price discovery. In other words, it seems that we are on the verge of circular reasoning, with prices being determined by prices themselves. Now, the only consistent theoretical interpretation of this sequence seems to be that the equilibrium towards which Vernon Smith's experiments converge should be considered as a sort of temporary equilibrium, not in the general sense of Higgs, but in a very peculiar partial sense of Vernon Smith. This is a rather unusual view of equilibrium, which will require further investigation. In any case, whatever the theoretical meaning we want to give to this equilibrium, it's clear that we are in front of a single photograph, a single fleeting frame of the entire movie of competition. But if Vernon Smith's intention is to be connected with the classics, then it must be taken into account that for the classics, price discovery corresponds to the scrolling not of a single frame, but of the whole movie of competition up to its ending. An ending that was unveiled only in the 20th century, especially thanks to Piero Sraffa. The question can be addressed by examining precisely Chapter 7 of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which Professor Vernon Smith considers as a cornerstone of the classical approach. The problem with Chapter 7 is that it contains no actual determination of prices. What can be found in that chapter is, in the first place, an account of the reason why what Adam Smith calls market prices will generally be found above or below the so-called natural prices, while natural prices correspond to a position in which profit rates are uniform among sectors and there is no reason to move capital from one sector to another one. It is indeed precisely in this connection that the individual's different willingness to pay, which Professor Vernon Smith justly refers to, has an important role in Adam Smith's analysis. But this is only half of the story, as Adam Smith further shows how competition will tend to lead market prices towards natural prices. Chapter 7 has to do, therefore, not so much with determination of prices as with the study of the so-called gravitation of market prices around natural prices. Now, the big issue is that Vernon Smith's attitude towards natural prices seems to be ambivalent. On the one hand, in one of his papers, and we saw something about that in lecture, in one of his papers, Vernon Smith seems to analyze precisely a problem of gravitation towards natural prices in the sense of Leontiev. On the other hand, however, Professor Smith seems to believe that natural prices are still linked to the old view of David Ricardo, who determined them in terms of quantity of labor. According to Vernon Smith, this Ricardian view has some flaws. It ignores the demand side of price formation and also attempts to address a metaphysical question. Maybe for these reasons, he states that insistence on long-run natural values represents a shortcoming of the classical approach. Now, on this subject, there might be some misunderstandings. In fact, the labor theory of value is not necessary to determine prices that are independent of demand. To reach that particular result, any modern non-substitution theory is sufficient, which obviously does not make use of labor value. But the misunderstanding might be more general. If we look at contemporary research, Vernon Smith's critique of natural prices seems to be in some respects outdated. In fact, since Ricardo's time, a lot of water has passed under the bridges of the classical approach. Subsequent contributions by John von Neumann, Wassily Leontiev, and in more explicit and general terms by Piero Sraffa and his followers, have provided a theory of natural prices, or in their current name, prices of production, which is fully consistent, that it can even admit a non-neoclassical influence of demand on prices, and does not need a labor theory of value. The more advanced versions of this line of classical thought have three essential features. First, a possible gravitation of market prices towards natural prices or prices of production in terms of price discovery. Second, a non-simultaneous determination of the distributive variables, with one of them determined in priority with respect to the other one, which brings to mind the problem of class struggle admitted by the classics and remarked by Marx. And third, a determination of prices that does not necessarily correspond to a full employment of labor, which evokes the problem of effective demand raised by Keynes and others. For these characteristics, according to Mann, the modern versions of the classical approach propose not only a consistent theory, but also a more realistic representation of a capitalist economy with respect to the neoclassical one. Now, I can assume that Vernon Smith considers the first feature quite familiar, while he may feel distant from the other Marxian and Keynesian features of this renewed classical approach. After all, Professor Vernon Smith has remarked that he came to Adam Smith and the classics through reading Hayek. Instead, we propose here a link that passes through Sraffa, who was an admirer of Marx and also the author of a famous and effective critique of Hayek's theory of prices. There are, however, two reasons why we hope that Professor Vernon Smith will consider the modern versions of the classical approach not in separate pieces, but in the only way they can be logically consistent, that is, as a whole. The first reason is theoretical. The concept of price discovery is very relevant But taken on its own, it does not allow to say much about crucial issues, such as the determinants of employment or the distributions between wages and profits. In order to address these questions, economists cannot do without a precise theory. And in this respect, we all agree that neoclassical theory must be discarded. But we should also add that not even Hayek's call to spontaneous order helps much for this scope. Therefore, there seems to be only one possible solution, a step forward towards Sraffa and the modern versions of the classical approach. The second reason is empirical. There is currently no reason to rule out that laboratory experiments could be readjusted in order not only to test Vernon-Smith's temporary equilibrium determined on the basis of exogenous reservation prices, but also to contribute to the investigations about gravitation or not towards prices of production. Gravitation is a topic on which research has continued, but in a context of pure theory or simulations rather than experiments with humans. In this light, it might be interesting to develop new laboratory tools to simulate gravitation. In conclusion, it seems to me quite clear that in his approach to the classics, Vernon-Smith needs Sraffa. But in turn, contemporary scholars of Sraffa could draw insights from a readjustment of Vernon-Smith's experiments to the case of gravitation. I think that such a heretical and daring channel of communication can open up. After all, Vernon-Smith is a master of heresy, like Hayek, but also like Marx, I suppose. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What about the connection with the changement in politics? The question that I posed before.
I'm sorry, what?
The possibility to have some implication of a heretical approach to economics in order to change the politics, in the sense that now in USA and Europe there is a dominance of populistic forces, and because there is the hope, I think that also Emiliano agreed with this, to change this way to handle with politics.
Well, my longtime associate and colleague, Charles Plot, did much of his career was concerned with extending laboratory experimental economics to political economy and to elections and that sort of thing. He's published a lot of papers on the median voter theorem and on other theorems that are derived from the application of these principles to voting institutions, discrete voting institutions. And I have one or two myself, although that's not been a major field. No, I heartily welcome all of that and refer you to Charlie Plot's work, okay?
Yes. Another question? Well, then we will thank again our three speakers.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I say something? Just a word.
Yeah.
Yes. I was not speaking about politics. I was speaking about economic theory. This is important. This is very, very important. Okay. The
Okay.
logical consistency of economic theory and the logical meaning of the important Vernon Smith experiments. Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Yeah.
And I particularly appreciate the comments on that important Italian writer, Sraffa. Okay, and Sabu, Inua, and I, and this is largely his work. We will have a second book out on classical economics that will deal with the followers of Adam Smith, the French and the Italian, as well as the English followers of Adam Smith, because they made important contributions, very important ones. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.